All right. Um, Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted to have John here as always on this Friday, the Self-Improvement Friday. So take it away, John.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. Today we are talking about a little bit of a philosophical concept. Jorge Luis Borges' short story called The Aleph. And we're going to get into, it's fine if you guys haven't read it, I'm going to summarize any relevant and necessary points. And we're looking at this under the perspective of how it relates to omniscience and existentialism. Omniscience simply meaning the state of knowing all, the state of complete knowledge of everything, and how you would cope with life if you were in that state of omniscience. So the summary of the story, it's very short, it's about 6 or 7 pages, and it's narrated from Borges in first person. So Borges is describing his memories of his beloved friend named Beatrice. Okay, and Beatrice recently passed away. So what Borges does is every year, I believe for her birthday, he goes to Beatrice's old house, and he begins to, have a recollection of Beatrice's life with the family members that still reside at the house. So in her memory. And over the years of doing this, he begins to become acquainted with her cousin, Carlos. Now, Carlos begins to talk to Borges a little bit, and every time they're together, Carlos always is insistent on sharing his new, breakthrough stance in poetry, or his new literature conclusion, or his new creation of verbiage. And Borges isn't really he's just kind of passively accepting it. He's like, okay, cool, I get linguistics is your thing, but I'm not really interested in it. He describes it as very verbose, very profound, kind of over his head, and it's not really his forte. So Carlos keeps, discussing this with him. And then one day, Borges, because Borges is only at their house for Beatrice's birthday, and then he goes back to his typical routine. So one day, out of the blue, Carlos actually calls Borges, which has never happened before. And he says the next door cafe to Beatrice's old house is actually expanding. And what they're going to do is buy out their house, and they're going to destroy it so they can have this real estate space to expand their interior of their cafe. So they're both very upset over this. I guess it's unassailable. They can't really question it, I guess. And Carlos expresses deep dissatisfaction because he slips up and he tells Borges on the phone, he says, oh no, I'm going to lose access to the Aleph. And Borges says, what is the Aleph? And then before Carlos can answer, Borges is like, you know what? No, I'm just going to go figure it out myself. I'm going to go see it. So Borges goes over the house again. And then Carlos leads him into the basement, and he says, okay, I'm going to show you the Aleph. A quick warning, it's going to rattle your brain. You're not really going to understand what you just experienced, but I deeply cherish and treasure this thing, and you'll understand why after you experience it. So Borges descends down into the basement, and long story short, in summarization, it's kind of difficult to explain, and Borges actually points this out in the text itself, because our linguistic and our, conceptual perception of time is linear. So it's sequential. We have a past, present, and future. So that's superimposed with language. I can explain things to you. I'm explaining concepts to you. I have to do this bit by bit by bit. But the Aleph, it's described in the story as a 2 or 3 centimeter wide, you could say orb of light, okay? And it's just kind of levitating in space in Carlos's basement. And when you look at it, you see literally everything. You see your past, you see your present, you see your future, you see things on the other side of the world, you see things on another planet, you see things in another galaxy, but it's not no duration of time is required for you to understand all this thing. It's instantaneous. You immediately become omniscient. So you immediately see everything. And this, I'm going to explain Borges' reaction when he looks into the Aleph. So he describes a page-long description of what he sees, all these little trivial details. I saw this, this house, I saw this sidewalk, I saw that tree, etc. But then his conclusion is, I saw the earth in the Aleph, and the Aleph in the earth, and then the earth in the earth and in the Aleph. I saw my face and I saw your face. I felt dizzy, and then I wept, because my eyes had seen that secret hypothetical object whose name has been mentioned by men, but by which no man has ever truly looked upon, the inconceivable universe. I had a sense of infinite veneration, infinite pity. So in short, you become completely omniscient. And I thought of this, this relationship to how you would cope with existence after, there's a short paragraph after this realization where Borges describes after he leaves Carlos's house. He says, out in the street, in the station, on the subway, all of the faces seemed familiar because he obviously just saw everything in the Aleph. All of these faces seemed familiar. I feared that there was nothing that had the power to surprise or astonish me anymore. I fear that I would never again be without a sense of deja vu. Fortunately, after a few sleepless nights, I began to forget. So he began to forget what he saw. And now my entire interpretation of this in this presentation today was hinged on that last sentence. He says, fortunately, fortunately, I began to forget. So in other words, he's painting a disdainful brush on omniscience. So he's saying it's an unfortunate thing to know everything. And that really got me thinking, like, how would you actually cope with existence? And I'm going to lead into, now we're going to talk about the implication of omniscience and like how we would cope with that in our daily life. First of all, I believe if you were omniscient, and I think also why Borges calls it unfortunate, because in short, there's nothing left for you to experience. And you can make the argument that even our, I guess, material, concrete, tangible approaches, what we gain possession of, are to address an intangible need. So you can make the argument that say you can, I guess, reverse engineer all of tangible desires into intangible, I guess, impulses. So in short, let's say I want to have a nice house. I want to have a nice car. I want to have a nice job. I want to have, these designer clothes. Whatever this happens to be, whatever you want that's tangible or materialistic, you can revert back to an intangible desire. I can say, I want that nice car because I want security, I want freedom, I want adventure, I want these things. So it's, in short, all of our tangible, I guess, expressions are to mitigate and to address an intangible need or intangible desire. And Borges, although obviously you didn't acquire everything materialistically, he still experienced what it would be like to have all of the things that he could possibly achieve and aim and acquire, right? And even things that we can't imagine, because we're of course superimposing what we know of the reality onto what he saw. He could have seen things that we can't even conceptualize, of course, because he's seen, again, the inconceivable universe. So and that makes me think of again, there would be nothing left for us to pursue. So that is the first point that I have. The second point is that we always act and we always decide and we always make decisions and habits in order to close a gap in our life, in order to close a gap between where we are right now and where we want to be in the future. So every single decision is made with the future in mind. So we are dissatisfied. And you can make the argument that motivation is predicated on deprivation, right? Motivation is predicated on deprivation. It's the desire to have something that you've never had or you don't currently have. Maybe you got something, you lost it, you want it again. It's something that you don't have right now. So in other words, there's a gap. You don't know what it is like to experience that thing. Sure, you can imagine, sure, you can conceptualize, you can try to superimpose what you think it would be like to have the objects of your desire, but you don't truly know until you are in possession of it or you've experienced it. So that's the second point. We act and we decide in order to close a gap in life. Again, motivation is predicated on deprivation or lack of something. The third point is, I was actually doing a little bit of research and I came across a study. It was called Functional Neuroanatomy of Pleasure and Happiness. And this was a 2010 study. And they looked at a lot of things in this study, obviously pleasure and happiness and neuroanatomy and dopamine and serotonin release, et cetera, and all that. And they came to the conclusion that fulfillment and satisfaction and success and happiness in life are largely governed by a intertwining of both wanting and liking things. So wanting and liking. So one, again, like we were talking about before, motivation is predicated on deprivation. You want something. Also, you are appreciative. You are grateful for what you do have and what you have earned in your lifetime through your discipline, through your sacrifice, through your struggles. So something important to learn is that they looked at this distinction and they say it's a nice balance, but I wouldn't say it's 50-50 balance, because if you look at the neuroanatomy in the study itself, there's a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and it's governed in this this cycle of pleasure and happiness and fulfillment and satisfaction. And what they realized is when we are appreciating something, when I say, I like these things that I have in my life, I'm content, I'm satisfied, I don't want to strive anymore, I'm just happy with what I have. That's fine. There's perfect utility and merit in that, but only 10% of the nucleus accumbens is activated. Only 10% of the neurons are firing in the act of liking something. Now, the other 90%, 100% of this area is lit up when we are wanting something, when we desire, when we are saying, okay, that's something I don't have, I'm going to strive toward that. 100% of it is lit up. And we have actually, through this study and through related studies, I was doing research, I came to the conclusion, I didn't even know this before, more dopamine is released when we are anticipating something than when we actually receive something. I didn't know that before. That's actually very interesting. It's kind of, it's really enlightening when you superimpose this. I'm going to get into some other works of fiction in a second to substantiate this point. But more dopamine, I'll share a reference after. You can just Google functional neuroanatomy of pleasure and happiness. You can find it. It's one of the first links. It was 2010. But so back to the dopamine. More dopamine is released in anticipation of something than actually, receiving something. And you can look at this by personal anecdote, okay? I'll give you a simple example. If you know that you have a 3-day weekend coming up, if you know Monday's a holiday, you have Monday off, okay? Friday and Saturday are probably going to be the most emotionally gratifying days for you because you're looking forward to something. And now when Monday comes, it's kind of bland. It's not really that satisfactory. It just feels like another Sunday. You know what I mean? You're not really as happy as you thought you would be. Another simple example is, all of us, if we can remember, or if we have kids ourselves, look at any child either the night before Christmas or on Christmas morning. Okay, this is the first time you'll see a child wake up at 6 or 7 a.m. because they're bouncing off the walls because they're anticipating what they might receive. Okay, and then you watch them once they open their gifts, once they ravage all the wrapping paper, they're just like, okay, is that it? They want to keep doing more things, keep unwrapping more presents. I guess a contemporary application of this in our adult lives is, I know I do this. If you ever order anything online, I'll put my order on Amazon, and then what am I doing? I'm checking my emails, seeing, okay, when is my estimated shipping date? When is my estimated arrival date? And then when I'm out, I'm at the gym, I come home, I'm looking at my mail, I'm looking at my mailbox, I'm looking at my back porch, I'm looking at my front porch, I'm looking for all these things. And I would say that's the adult equivalent of a child on Christmas. You're anticipating opening something. And then once you open whatever you ordered online, it just goes in its respective place. You open it, if it's clothes, you put it in your closet. If it's a kitchen item, you put it on your counter, whatever it is. And then you're just like kind of unsatisfied after that, and I think that's an anecdotal example of more dopamine is released when we are anticipating something than actually, appreciating or in the possession of something. So the researchers in this study also did, I don't exactly know how they did it, but they were able to, engage their way with rats to shut off this desire for something, to shut off or limit the release of dopamine in anticipation of something. And in short, what happened to the rats is they died because they didn't even have the desire to eat food or drink. So they literally just stayed in one spot. They didn't even move. So they didn't have any dopamine release from anticipating something, and they literally wouldn't even eat. So you look at that, and that's a very profound, I guess, conclusion and insight. And again, they concluded with, fulfillment, happiness, success, growth is hinged on a good balance of both wanting and liking. And when you say balance, I don't think they mean 50-50. I would argue it's more 90-10. And to do this, I actually want to go into my fourth point, which is it's a passage from a short story. He's one of my favorite authors, actually, Fyodor Dostoevsky. And this is a book called Notes from Underground. It's chapter 9. And he's basically talking about a critique of utopia. And he's talking about, I'm just going to read the quote. So it's pretty much encapsulating exactly what we're talking about here. We like the process of attaining more than having attained. So he says, man is instinctively afraid of attaining his object and completing the edifice he is constructing. Who knows? Perhaps he only loves that edifice from a distance and is by no means in love with it at close quarters. Perhaps he only loves building it and does not want to live in it, but will leave it when it is completed. He goes on, he says he loves the process of the game and not the end of it, like a chess player. He says, perhaps the only goal on earth to which we are striving lies in this endless process of attaining. In other words, in life itself and not the thing to be attained. The thing is just a placeholder. It's a tool. It's an object for us to express this human will of creative goal striving, I would argue. Dostoevsky continues. He says he feels that when he has found it, there will be nothing left for him to look for. And then he concludes with, he loves the process of attaining, but does not like quite having to attain. You can observe a certain awkwardness about him when he has attained his object. And he goes on to critique this entire notion of utopia, basically saying if we had all the things that we desired, if we had economic prosperity, we didn't have any security, or we didn't have any lack of security, we didn't have any suffering, we would somehow figure out a way to mess it up. And this is his famous notion, because we are men and not piano keys. So he goes on to critique this, and he says this idea of a utopia, meaning he calls it a crystal palace. So crystal palace is a place of no wanting because you have everything that you desire. And he says the crystal palace may be an idle dream. So that's the key word there, idle. It doesn't move. It's just, you've established this and it's like, okay, I'm set. That's all I ever want in my life. I'm set. You're not updating your goals. It may be an idle dream, but it is inconsistent with the laws of nature, and I invented it only through my own stupidity. So he's using a character to argue this point, obviously. He doesn't believe these things. But I thought that was very profound when I read this. And this made me think of something, ironically enough, from a completely different realm of fiction. And this is in a book called Alice's Adventure Through the Looking Glass, Alice in Wonderland. And there's a part in this story where it beautifully encapsulates this point in symbolic format. So the story it's obviously following Alice, as we all know. And there's a part in Through the Looking Glass where she's traveling through the river with a merchant. I think this merchant was a sheep or something, whatever, it's not important. And she's traveling through this river, and then she notes there's these beautiful flowers that she sees at the river floor, or maybe on the side of the river. And she's like, oh, those are beautiful. I'm sure they smell wonderful. They look very aesthetically pleasing. I want to pick them. So she goes and she picks them, and she comes to two very, very profound conclusions, but you might just gloss over them if you weren't looking for these things. So the first thing she notices is that as soon as she picks these flowers, as soon as she reaches out into the depths, gets them into her boat, she notices, one, their scent begins to fade immediately, and they begin to wither away. Like their flowers and their leaves begin to just like shrivel up and wither away. And then she's like, they're not as beautiful as they once were. And the second profound realization is, she says, this is my favorite line in all of Lewis Carroll's work. She says, the prettiest are always further. Meaning like her prettiest flowers. She thought it was really peculiar that even though she picked these beautiful flowers, she put them in her boat, she was in attainment of them, okay? Again, nucleus accumbens, only 10% lit up when she's liking the flowers, but the other 90% is saying, hey, those are pretty too. Hey, those are even prettier. Those are even prettier. And the prettiest are always further. So you're never going to reach that goal. And I actually think that's a beautiful thing. If you don't have the correct philosophy, people can look at that as very destructive and very, I guess, pessimistic. Oh, you're never going to be satisfied, so why try anything? This can be a very slippery chasm into nihilism, which I think is it's absolutely reprehensible way to approach that. I think it's actually beautiful, because if you look at everything in nature, I'm not going to go through it now, but you can actually trace everything in ontology, everything in organic existence, all plants, all insects, all animals, even our human body, all our human vessel, everything is actually it's called an asymptote. What an asymptote is, there's an ideal that it can never reach, but all life, all plants, through it's a little bit more of a complex subject. It's called the Fibonacci ratio, in accordance with the phi ratio, 1.6180339. It's an infinite number. There's a lot of mathematics involved, but in short, I can actually prove conclusively that all organic biological life is striving toward an unattainable goal. But the beauty in that is it is continually improving, continually adapting, evolving, expanding toward this goal, even though it's unattainable, even though, as Alice says, the prettiest are always further. You're never going to attain this. And I think that's great. I think that's beautiful. I think it is what makes life so exciting and such a fulfilling adventure and journey. So this leads me into the third point of this discussion today in our application. So what can we learn from this state of omniscience and Borges? What can we learn from Dostoevsky and Alice in Wonderland? How can we apply this information? And I want to read there's a quote from Shakespeare where he says, "Things won are done. Joy's soul lies in the doing." Joy's soul, the soul of joy, lies in doing. That's very important. So an application of this, I would say, is we should be continually moving once we attain things. As Alice, once we attain the object of our desire, it's absolutely fine to, you know, sit back and reflect and appreciate. You know, look at this, the equivalent of a hike. You know, if I hike a mountain with, you know, thousands of feet elevation, I'm not just going to hike up and hike down. I'm going to hike up. I'm going to be like, wow, this view is beautiful. This is completely rewarding for all of this strenuous effort that I took to get to this height. But I'm not going to sit there forever, because eventually familiarity breeds contempt. I'm going to sit there and be like, yes, it's beautiful, but like, okay, what's next? You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the unrest in the soul. And I think it's beautiful. It's like, okay, what's next? I just conquered this mountain. I conquered myself. What is next? What's the next mountain? Where's my next step? I think that's beautiful. So it's like, you don't have to be all, I think it's a proper ratio. Maybe it's 80-20, maybe it's 90-10, as is in neurobiology, the nucleus accumbens, it is 90-10. So we should have a balance, and we should continually move from win to win. And also, this makes me think of a quote for the inverse. We should also move from failure to failure. I think it was Winston Churchill. He said, success is nothing more than moving from failure to failure without the loss of enthusiasm. So I think it's very beautiful. So you should keep it pushing. Even if you're winning, okay, keep it pushing, keep moving forward. If you're losing, okay, keep it pushing, keep recalibrating, keep, you know, implementing the insight that you gained from your defeats into a better course, so you can correct course and then move uphill. So in short, as Shakespeare says, joy's soul lies in the doing. Things won are done. I would even argue things lost are done too. It's in the past. It already happened. Okay, you're in the now. What are we doing now? Doing. That's the most important thing. So the second point for application, it's kind of related to the Shakespeare thing. I would say always have a clear goal in front of you. Okay, always have a clear goal in front of you. Earl Nightingale, who is like a father of the personal development industry, he says success is literally defined as the progressive realization of a worthy goal. That's the best definition I've ever been able to find in my entire life. Out of the hundreds of books that I've read about success, success is the progressive realization of a worthy goal. What does that mean? Progressive, continually updating. Worthy goal, obviously something that you've established that's going to bring you something at the end result, and it's also going to shape you in the process of the result. So we should always have something in front of us to look for. We should always know what we're going to aim for. We should never experience, I would argue, never experience boredom or apathy, because I think those states are from not having a clear to-do list or clear, you know, metrics in front of us on what to do. So this leads me into our third point, which is from a not a mentor, but a mentee of Earl Nightingale, which is a man named Jim Rohn, where he says, success is not something that you pursue. It is something you attract by the person you become. So this leads into my point that I was just talking about a second ago, where it's not about the end result of the goal. So when we set a goal, it's not about, you know, let's say I set a goal to make a certain amount of dollars a month. It's not really necessarily about the money. It's about the person that I would become in the process. I would become a more valuable person. I would become a more efficient, you know, at my career, at my profession. I would become a better individual in the process. Therefore, my skills are transferable and I can do it again. So we should set goals not only for the object, you know, back of that goal, but we should also set goals for the person that we are going to become in the process. In short, we become the person who deserves that goal, if that makes sense. And that's how we attract things. That's the meaning behind his statement. Success is something you attract by the person you become. So you set these goals that push you out of your comfort zone. You set these goals that demand you develop your faculties and your character and your traits, and then you attract these things to you. You become worthy, and you get exactly what you deserve in life. I'm a firm believer of that. I think life is completely fair. We always reap what we sow. So the fourth point is kind of unrelated to omniscience or existentialism, but I thought it was still relevant of a talking point. In this study of the functional neuroanatomy of pleasure and happiness, they actually talked about one of the most, I guess, important governing variables for satisfaction and happiness and fulfillment, and that was a rich, dynamic social life. I thought that was beautiful that they put that in there. So, you know, go out of our comfort zone, do everything that we can to cultivate that. You know, it's not only about just this personal development. It's not only about these goals. It's also about, you know, living a rich, dynamic life that is full of differentiating opinions and perspectives and feedback and people that you can rely on, and building a strong base of a community in sorts. And the fifth part is a quote. I know I have a lot of quotes. This is from Ernest Hemingway. And he says, "True nobility lies in being superior to your former self." So in short, never, compare yourself to someone else's journey. We talked about this last week in Imitation is Suicide and Not Wearing a Mask. Envy is Ignorance, Imitation is Suicide. That's from Emerson. Always compare yourself to who you were yesterday, because you are 99.9% similar to that individual yesterday. You have the same handicaps, you have the same advantages, you have the same abilities and capacities and tendencies as that person. So I think it's wise to do that. And you should measure the value of your growth in terms of how far you are from your baseline. What I mean by baseline, let's take physiology, for example. If somebody who is, let's say they're 200 pounds and they're like 20% body fat, so they don't really have like a six pack yet, but they slim down a lot. That's still noble if they started at 260 pounds and 30% body fat. Okay, that's still noble, even though they're not comparing themselves to the person who's 190 pounds and 10% body fat. Don't do that. It's because that person's on a different journey. What the important point is how far they have come from baseline. Similarly, the person who is, let's say they're 180 pounds and they have a little bit of muscle, they put a little bit of muscle on, but they're comparing to somebody who's a professional bodybuilder, for example. They're going to be discouraged. But if they started at 140 pounds with no muscle, it's still admirable. It's still noble because they've transcended beyond their former self. I think we get very caught up in this, in comparing, and it's very detrimental to our psychology and to our motivation and to our fulfillment. So I always try to live with that as a principle, again, from Hemingway. True nobility lies in being superior to your former self. So with that said, I am going to pass it on to Shrikant. He's going to moderate questions, and then we're going to move forward.
All right, folks. So it's time for questions. We have 4 rules as usual. You can line up for questions by typing an exclamation mark in Zoom. John, I'm just going to mute you so that there is no feedback. You can unmute whenever you want. Second, so that's the first rule. Line up for questions by typing exclamation mark. Second, keep on topic. Third, be brief. And fourth, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything, but do so courteously. So it's going to be Joe first. Joe, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, John. Awesome presentation as always. I'm going to try and ask this question because I'm just thinking it through in my head. So hopefully it's not too out there. I thought about the immortals, like what would happen if you lived forever and you had all your experiences, and then what would we do? Would we invent something like death? I mean, or as a optimal way of looking at the world. So the idea that we would know everything, that would we invent something like forgetting, like senility almost to a certain degree, as an optimal way, and that becomes an analogy for maybe manufacturing our own realities. Right. So this is how we basically create our own reality. So my question is that what he's actually getting at? Is he getting at that what we do is we create what we think we want? Like we invent what we want. Is that what Jorge is getting to?
Yeah, I mean, we had, I would actually recommend the Immortal if you haven't read this by him. All of his stories are very short. The Immortal we talked about before, and it's kind of a similar premise. Like eventually they would be omniscient. They would live 100 lifetimes because obviously they're immortal, but it's delayed, it's prolonged. So I would actually look at that as more admirable because you're on this journey of like, okay, great. I thought I was going to die at 60. Now the future is completely uncertain. I can now travel the world. I can do all of these things that I've always been wanting to do, but death was just looming over me. I can, finally see these things. I can read these books. I have all the time in the world. And Borges did a very good job at elucidating this point because in his example of the immortals, they actually built these phenomenal societies, phenomenal architecture for the first, I think it was like first few centuries or something like that. But then after enough lifetimes, they got very apathetic, they got very dull, and they literally became these, he calls them troglodytes, like cave dwellers, and they would just walk around the desert and they wouldn't do anything. They would literally sleep all day because they can engage in their imagination all day long. So that's a very good, I guess, philosophical question: would they invent death? I think it's worth looking into, and I think he is pointing at that, what we would truly want, because this is hinged on the last sentence in the book where he's talking about he fortunately began to forget things because he looked at this as a burden. He looked at omniscience as an actual burden, even though I would argue one of the prime motivating factors that he looked into the Aleph was to experience his memories of Beatrice, because he was beginning to forget. He was an older gentleman and he wanted to relive those memories, relive those experiences. And he got more than he asked for. He bit off more than he can chew. And I do think that I wouldn't say you invented forgetfulness, but if and this is one of the questions in the breakout group, but if you couldn't forget, I think he would try to forget. So I think he would, deliberately try to manufacture and contrive something. I do, yeah.
Next up is Shelley.
Thank you.
See. Let's see who else. Shelley, Daniel, Jonathan, and Dave. Shelley, go ahead.
Hey, John. Enjoy hearing you again tonight. So I have a statement and then my question, which my statement is that I don't think that life is fair. How did you say it? Completely fair. Although I don't think that the lessons learned through the unfairness, which can cause you to grow and actually can be good, right? The unfairness of life can be beneficial to someone. But you said life is completely fair. I'd really like you to expound on that, because that is not my experience, and I've lived a hell of a lot of years. You know what I'm saying? So with that, take it away.
Absolutely. I could be inexperienced in my youth, absolutely, but from my conclusions, and I don't think anybody is without their share of troubles and misfortunes. But I think it's predicated on something you actually just said there. Somebody turned and transmuted and sublimated a unfair experience into a positive counterpart. So I would argue that's fair in retrospect, of course, looking back at it. And you can argue that all of our circumstances, all of our results in our life, we chose, okay? Or at least we chose our reaction to our circumstances that were exerted upon us. So maybe I grew up with only one parent. Maybe I grew up poor. Maybe I grew up these, okay? But you don't have to let those circumstances define you. Once you are of age for inductive reasoning, once you can actually question things and design your own journey on yourself, I believe that if you look around at your life, all of the results that you have, I say it's fair because you look at all the results and you chose them at one point. Either the current you or the past you chose them. So if I say, for example, this is actually an autobiographical example. I went on a hike last weekend, okay, with my friend. And my friend was struggling to get up the hill. It was I think it was like an elevation of 3,000 feet or something like this. And I go at a pretty fast pace. So I was going and he was like, no, I stop. I need a break. Like, this sucks. And I'm like, no. Of course, I turned this into an opportunity for a rant and a lesson. I was like, no, this doesn't suck. This is actually natural. What sucks is your past decisions and neglect that led you to this point of this being difficult for you. If you think about that, it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, it comes off a little bit preachy and unsympathetic, but I truly believe that. I truly believe that, it was fair because he chose that life or he engaged in those decisions that junk food, of sitting around watching Netflix instead of exercising, because it's exactly what he wanted at that time in his life. I'm not judging him for that. I'm saying he's reaping what he's sowing. He's sown those seeds in the past because he wanted that thing. He was at that crossroads of, okay, do I go to the gym? It's late. Or do I sit on the couch and watch Netflix and do it tomorrow? He chose Netflix, and that's fine. He chose to do these things because it's exactly what he wanted at that given point. So if you look at this from a large macrocosmic perspective, with depth, I do subscribe to the idea that life is fair. I do subscribe to the idea that we reap what we sow. Maybe not in terms of, again, there's definition here, what fair would mean, but maybe not in terms of what we are given at birth, whether there's mental discrepancies between one person or another, or physical ailments, or a sickness, or a genetic predisposition to a disease. But I'm talking about practical results that we all attain in our adult life. That's what I'm talking about as fair.
Next up is Daniel, Jonathan, Dave, Sanjay, Miranda, and Deborah. So Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, John. I think that was a really great talk about what you were talking about, life being fair. I have sort of like too many questions that are related to it. I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So Jordan Peterson said that, life is full of inequalities, but it's not because of like someone deliberately keeping people down. It's like, he said when, like, he gave an analogy of like a stockbroker that initially when he starts, he's going to fail, he's going to do badly, but the more he persists and he becomes successful, then the more successful he becomes, the easier success becomes to him. It becomes almost like secondhand. So when people are like pushing very hard, even if they fail, like when they get like some success, then that success builds on and on. It becomes like a perpetual machine. Like, would you qualify that as fairness? And the second thing is that a lot of people tend to complain, like, like psychopaths, sociopaths, they tend to like succeed and the nice guys fail. But there's always sometimes, I think, like a hidden element of karma that will bite them, if not outwardly, then inwardly. And would you also relate that to fairness? I don't know if that's like pertinent, but.
I mean, I don't really understand the context of the second question. I mean, I don't know what you mean by the nice guys fail and the
Well, I mean, that's like the popular complaint, but I feel like if you do bad behaviors in your life, do you think like karma will come to as a form of like equalizing things and making life fair that way? Like, if you're a bad person, it's going to bite you back eventually.
Yeah, I absolutely do believe that. I do absolutely believe you reap what you sow. I think these words that we've established, such as karma and luck, are simply to try to encapsulate the universal law of cause and effect that we can't fully track. So I do believe in the validity of this. I do completely believe that we reap what we sow. I don't believe we fully get away with anything, even if it's, eating away at our conscience, or it's somehow externally, linked back to us through some chain of millions of causal effect and causal and effectual relationships that we can't conceptually track. And I saw somebody in the chat say the word just. That might be what more of I mean. You know what I mean? We might be just like at a discrepancy in terms of our definition of terms here. But in short, I think we always get back what we put out. That's kind of what I mean by fair. And I think there is a lot of philosophical undertones behind, like, okay, does everybody get what they deserve in their life? Do people not get what they deserve? And I think there's a million different answers for that, like in terms of how we are to define what deserve means, how we are to define what the word fairness means, how we are to define what just means. So there's a lot of context and nuance here, but in short, I wouldn't say unequivocally, okay, a nice guy fails and a psychopath succeeds. I would say first of all, I would say define success and failure. Second of all, I would say they're going to reap what they sow. So whatever they put out into the world, into their relationships, into the workplace, into the economy, into the environment, into their relationships, into their dialogue with themselves, that's going to come back and manifest in physical form for them.
Next up is Jonathan.
Thanks, Shrikant. And thanks for organizing the talk again, John. So my question is, I read the Aleph and I found it very difficult. Was the point of the Aleph, so you have omniscient knowledge, like you know everything and you've experienced everything? Is that the idea? And then because you've experienced everything, you have no desires for that push you in any direction because you're able to live and feel everything at that moment. Is that what the idea is?
Well, the second part, that's my interpretation. I wouldn't think you have any desire. I don't think he outwardly explains that, but yeah, I would think so. I think it's a logical conclusion, yeah.
Can I just follow up with the relationship between that and then having the constraint of no longer having the constraint of being mortal, which is what you and Joseph were just talking about. So what's the similarities and differences to that in that short story?
What are the similarities and differences?
Yeah, as far as like unconstrained. So in this case, you've experienced everything, you know everything, and in the other one, you don't die ever. So
Right. Yeah. So the other one, I don't know if you were here for that. We did that probably a month and a half ago or something. It was called The Immortal, and it's actually a short story by Borges, another one. And it's a similar premise, but you don't really know everything, but you're simply immortal. So you live forever. And the premise behind that was, one, there's no motivation because there's no end result. There's no like constraining time format. I have to, live my career because there's no end. So it's like you could do whatever you want, and then you can just like dissipate all of your energy. Two, eventually this is the more philosophical point. If you look at it a little bit deeper, there's no differentiation between members and constituents of a species, meaning that one man can live 1,000 lives. That was kind of his argument in there, because like you can do everything, you can experience all of these perspectives, predicated, of course, if you have the ability to, like the cognitive ability to. But I would argue that's approaching a point of omniscience. And eventually what those people did in the story is they did nothing. They were very apathetic, and they just dwelled in the desert, and they didn't build anything. They didn't work together. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't even move. They literally slept for years and years and years and decades at a time, and they just sat there. So I would think that's a logical conclusion of omniscience. So omniscience, the Aleph in the story, it's like a 10,000 year jump in an instant. And I think that it was hinged on the fact that he said, fortunately, I began to forget things. I don't think that I would want to know everything, right? I mean, I do love learning. I love, exploring new ideas and new concepts. I love, eradicating my ignorance. I love, broadening my scope and illumination of what I believe to be true and right. But I don't think I would want that completely expanded across the universe in an instant. I really don't think that I would, because I love the process of learning. As I brought up with Alice in Wonderland and Dostoevsky, and like the nucleus accumbens in our biology, I think it's what makes us human, is to strive, is to keep going. So once we had that, you can make the argument that even though I might pursue after tangibles like money or like success or like a car or a house or like these objects, but I've still experienced the thing conceptually that those emotions, or that those things would bring me emotionally or intellectually. So I think that's a big similarity, is like omniscience is a immediate jump into, I would say, intellectual immortality, in short.
Next up is Dave, followed by Sanjay. Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Shrikant, and thank you, John. Seeing your description of tonight's topic about being all knowledge and control reminded me of a play I saw about 15 years ago, and it kind of relates to Joe's question. It was very simple, just a main character in a tree. And the story is that up the tree is the evildoer, whether, I forget what they call it, Satan or the devil or the Grim Reaper. But as long as the main character had the character up the tree, no one would die. And of course, nothing about how it happened or how you could keep him up the tree. And of course, there's a dialogue and this, please let me out, everything else. But the play ends when a young boy is brought in the scene that is terribly ill. It's been diagnosed, there's no cure, and he's in great pain. And the compassionate thing is he needs to die. So the play ends as he lets the evildoer out of the tree. So I just thought I'd throw that in, just another thought. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you remember the name of that? It sounds interesting, actually.
No, I apologize. I don't remember the name of it. I'm scratching my head, but I wish I did.
Okay.
It's, like I say, about 15 years ago.
Okay. Thank you.
Next up is Sanjay, followed by Miranda. Sanjay, go ahead.
So I have not read the short story, but it sounds very interesting. I think I will. I didn't have time earlier. So I think, so based on what you're describing, it looks like Borges is making many assumptions. So I'm going to just take one assumption and ask a question around that. So what if after we reach omniscience, we realize that there are others like us, that there are other omniscient beings around us, that basically there's a community of similar omniscience? How would that change the story, right? So the question that I'm raising really exemplifies one of the assumptions that he's making, is that you would be alone in this world, and that and that's some of the negativity that it sounds like he's talking about, that you know everything but you'd have nothing to do. And I think that that's an assumption. I don't think necessarily we know that.
Yeah, I mean, that I didn't even think of that in terms of like the social ability scale. But even if we had that, even if we had like other omniscient beings, you could argue that he still experienced what it would be like to be in a community and experience this connection with these other omniscient beings and have this group and community. He experienced all of that in the moment he glimpsed into the Aleph. You could still make the argument that he already experienced that and already valued it and already came to watch it, you know, establish and then watch it crumble. You know, you can argue that he already saw those things in the universe. But I do think in terms of like in terms of the contrast with his daily life, once he goes back to, you know, the subway and he's like, oh my God, like I'm at such a discrepancy between me and all the other people around me. I do think that highlighted his sense of like existential dread. So I do think the story would change if like maybe he had a more conversation with Carlos, for example, who's been using the Aleph for his poetry and his literature. I think the story would be a lot different. But the story, you know, it unfolded that way because Borges was just very overwhelmed when he looked into it, and then he kind of immediately left Carlos's house. He's like, I got to figure this out. I can't deal with this right now. The story would be very different if he said, oh, I saw this. What did you see? You know, that might actually be worthwhile. Maybe you can make the argument. I don't know. But if it was like me in Borges' shoes, he does a good job at positing it as like dangerous or undesirable.
Next up is Miranda, followed by Deborah with the H. Miranda, go ahead.
Thanks, John. Something I wanted to talk about that came to my mind when I was reading the story was around perhaps the idea of a modern equivalent or equivalent in our world is the use of psychedelics. And that for some people, the desire is to kind of unlock some mystery of the universe, or at least themselves, to really understand everything there is to know about themselves and their own mind. So my question would be, do you think that is a parallel? And also, if you do have that access, not so much to all knowledge of the world, but all knowledge of yourself, how that might impact upon the ideas of joy is in the doing and the striving and the anticipation, if we were to know everything about ourselves in that instant.
Absolutely. Very good question. There's been a lot of research, and I've actually, I was watching something recently. I think Jordan Peterson was talking about psychedelics and like the recent studies on it. And frequently when people had what's known as like a good trip, like they got something out of it and they had like an intention, they weren't doing it for like entertainment pleasures. They weren't doing it as like an escape or anything. Like they weren't using it for like a drug. They were using it as a tool or a medicine. They actually regarded that, you know, experience as one of the most meaningful in their lives. It's a very, very interesting point. Upwards with like their marriage or having children, like one of the most transformative experiences. And you look at the neuroscience behind it, and frequently people will report like, I don't know, mixing of senses. Like, so you'll say, okay, what did you experience? Oh, I heard, or I saw music, or I heard colors. Like, what does that mean? Like when people say that, and you look at the neuroscience, what psychedelics, what people believe they're doing, they actually, I'm not gonna say rewire the brain, but if you look at like the brain's neural pathways as like a river, so it's digging deeper and deeper ruts into this like malleable earth below it. That's kind of how our neurons work. So we're kind of used to thinking a certain way. And what psychedelics does, I think it like, from my understanding, it will kind of like rewire this and like it'll connect a neuron through a sequence of events to a neuron, and that pathway has never been explored before. So that's the hypothesis behind why people say things like, oh, you know, like I said, I hear colors or I see music or something like that, because these neurons have literally never been connected. So, and this brings me to the second point. I mean, your second, the latter half of that question is a very important one. I mean, what would you do if you had the access to your complete internal world? If you had access immediately, and there's other psychedelics that do this as well, like DMT or something, for your complete internal world, for all of your conditioning, for all of your trauma, for all of the things you've been repressing, for all of the things you've been neglecting, for all of the information that you need to hear right now, whether you like it or not. Should you do that? Or would you do that? Or what would you do in response to that information? I think that largely varies by temperament and, like, I guess, propensity to face truth, strength of a person's character, their ability to deal with the unknown, their ability to deal with the malevolence inside themselves, their ability to, you know, shatter the hypotheses that they believe that they've been living with. There's so many implications here. But in short, I mean, the science all recommends it can be a good tool for the right person.
Next up is Deborah, followed by Aaron. Deborah with the H. Go ahead.
Okay, so my comment, I guess, is similar to what Shelley was saying. I reacted pretty strongly to when you said you get everything that you deserve, and I don't know exactly how you meant that, but I feel like, you know, I understand people want to feel in control, and I'm a huge proponent of like personal agency and autonomy, but I think you can be an amazing empathetic person, and it definitely doesn't mean your results are fair. So I was saying, like, we were talking about this in the chat, I don't think it's fair to ask people to find silver linings or to grow from tragedies. Like, I was talking about a personal example, like being a child and having your parent die, like that's out of your control. And to kind of argue that, like, well, it depends on like how you respond to it, or like you should grow from it. I don't know, my whole life, like people told me that. And I think it can come across as very insensitive to people who've gone through that. So I think sometimes if you haven't experienced something like a painful experience that someone else has, you may not be able to identify with that. What I did want to say though, that I liked that you said, was that I think you can choose what defines you. So I don't know, like that was my kind of takeaway from that. The idea that like, yes, maybe something has happened, or maybe like something isn't fair, but like it doesn't have to be who you are, but it can be like a part of who you are, I guess. I don't know, I guess it's not really a question. It was just a comment that like, yeah, the idea that people might deal with things differently. So I don't know that it's fair to say that everything's fair. I think it's just kind of catch-all statement, but it can be insensitive to people.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I do see what you're saying. I mean, I think I came to that conclusion in observation of, if you look at, let's say I look at any discrepancy between me and somebody who has results that I want. So let's say, I don't know, Shrikant has, you know, he has a higher vocabulary than me. And I can make an argument that says, oh, that's not fair because you had great schooling. You had better schooling in your country. You had both parents that read a lot growing up. You had books in your household growing up. You had access to the internet before I did, etc. I can look at any discrepancy in terms of like what contributed to that person's results. And I have the option to either victimize myself because of it, and I can say that's not fair because you did that, you had that, and I didn't. Or I can, again, I think this is related to your latter half of your comment. I can choose not to let that identify me and find. I kind of agree with you, and it's like just saying, oh, find a silver lining. That might not be always like universally constructive statement, but for sake of example, I can find the silver lining. I can find the equivalent advantage to this defeat, and then surmount those obstacles. Because I thought of this example when, you know, if I ever wanted to, you know, victimize myself by saying this isn't fair because that person has those results and I don't, because I could attribute it to any discrepancy, because they had this, because they had access to that, whatever it happens to be. But all it takes to invalidate that entire victim mindset is one person who had equal or less than me and attained more. That's all it takes. That is literally all it takes to obliterate my argument of like, it's not fair because X, Y, Z. So if this person did it, if this person is more successful, more happy, more grateful, more satisfied with less than I have no right to complain. I have no right to say this isn't fair. I have no right to attack the world, to attack other people and psychologically project and say you have those results because this, because that, and then feel bad for myself. So I think self-pity is a psychological poison. And this might be like not really related to the core point, but I'm just kind of going off in a tangent now. But yeah, I think we could be like lost in terminology in terms of like fair or just or deserve. You know, there could be more like exploration there. I could have done a better job at explaining it, obviously, but yeah.
Next up is Aaron, Deborah with an A, followed by Paul.
Hey, John, another great discussion. I kind of want to go back to something you said earlier in discussion with climbing the mountain and then reaching the top and not just staying there on the top, like finding the next thing. I 100% agree with that. I think that's awesome. Like, we're not meant to just sit there and look at the rainbow forever and ever. However, I do want to point out one thing. In Buddhism, there's this idea of kind of being comfortable with where you're at and being in the present. So if you got to the top of that mountain, like, I think there is a moment that you need to spend kind of just admiring where you are and being grateful for having such a wonderful view. I don't think it's as like quickly as being like, up top of the mountain, let's go ahead and climb that taller mountain over there. I think there is a moment where you do appreciate and you do take in all the senses and you kind of live in the present. So I'm wondering if you could make like accommodation for that a little bit in your philosophy.
No, I completely agree. I mean, like I said earlier, I think in the study of the functional neuroanatomy of pleasure and happiness, they argue that it's predicated on a balance of liking and wanting. So, you know, I think that they didn't really define like quantitatively that proportion, like 80% wanting and 20% liking. I don't know, but I reference back to the example of the nucleus accumbens, when 10% is lit up during liking something and 90% is lit up during wanting. I'm not, now, am I proposing that we should spend 90% of our lives wanting and only 10% in gratitude? I don't know the answer to that, really. I think it depends on temperament. But I do think we all have a sense of, like, you know, as you're saying, once we reach this peak of the summit, you know, and I just went to, I was actually just in New Hampshire last weekend. I was at this is the example I was using with a friend on a hike. It was like, I think 3,200 foot summit. And same thing, you know, I got up and I was like, this is a beautiful view. This is breathtaking. I've never been up this high before. This is great. And then I was like, I didn't stay up there for long. I probably stayed up there. The hike probably took, I don't know, 2.5 hours. And I was probably up there for 15 minutes. And then I was like, all right, I'm done. Like, I need to climb back down. I gotta do something else. But maybe that's just my temperament. Maybe 15 minutes is my, you know, my time. You know what I mean? But I do agree with you. You're not just going to be like, okay, what's next? What's next? What's next? Because you're going to miss the beauty and the magic in the present moment. I do agree with you. So it is a balance.
Next up is Deborah Kivistu.
I love the way you say my name correctly. Hardly anybody does. Okay, so John, I want to get back to Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. And I think I have a copy of it, but I need to read it because, as you know, maybe you remember, I'm reading Walden 2 about a utopia. I'm about halfway through it. And I want to blow up your argument about a utopia is all your dreams have come true, and you're like you're not in a state of flux. So in this book, a utopia is a constant state of flux because you're always designing a better way of doing things, and you're using concepts of better engineering. When you think about how incredibly complex life is, there's no way that you could ever get stagnant. And then also, it's social engineering really that he's getting to in this book. Because as we know, especially today, our problems are horrific when it comes to interactions between people. So one of the simple things they do when children are young is they condition them to become accustomed to discomfort, kind of to strengthen their character and to get them to be detached from problems like envy and jealousy and that sort of thing. So there's lots of experimentation to find the best way of doing things. And also, once it's designed well, or once you really get it taken off, you have way less labor that you have to do and a lot more time for creativity. So could you speak to that, what you think about that versus Dostoevsky's model?
Yeah, so I do believe they can be coalesced. So Dostoevsky's model is talking about there's no desire for novel experiences. There's nothing to improve because it's already, you know, as it's encoded in the language that he uses, crystal palace. It's already been truncated. It's already been shaped. It's already ideal. You cannot, also crystal, like a diamond, it's unbreakable. It's impervious. And he also calls it an idle dream. So it's standstill. And that's basically saying, okay, give me $10 million and I'm on an island and I have nothing to worry about for the rest of my life and I can never be hurt or suffer. That's like his argument, but kind of, it's like there's nothing else to do. But even then you would go mad because you would need something to do. And I would agree that, you know, it sounds like in Walden too, it's arguing that this state of constant flux is a utopia. Like that is the optimal way to live congruent with nature. That's one of my favorite, I guess, fundamental mantras of Stoicism, to live consistently with nature. There's a lot of implications there. So when you're living in flux with nature, you're constantly improving, you're constantly emulating all of what biology and all of what nature does and all of ontology, and that is to emulate an asymptote. Even though you're never going to reach this ideal goal, you still strive for it, you still improve, you're still, you know, as Hemingway keeps saying, as I keep saying from Hemingway, you're being superior to your former self, day after day, after decision, after decision, after action, after action. It's a continual state of advancement. And I do think that is I would argue that it's utopia. And once you arrive at that state, you know, as Adam was just talking about, as we were just talking about, you're kind of, there's this sense of like uneasiness once you already attain something. Like, okay, what's next? What do I need to do? Yes, I'm happy that I got here, but like, what's next? I need to keep striving. So I do think they can actually be reconciled completely in terms of their verbiage. So yeah, the constant state, the constant transformation, Dostoevsky would also make that argument that is beneficial. And then once you stop doing that, once you just kind of, once you don't have anything else to strive for, then it becomes an actual dystopia, even though I would say the unenlightened would look at that as a utopia.
So the last question is from Paul, and then we're going to do the breakout rooms. Then we'll come back, we'll do the takeaways, and then we'll choose some topics. And one of the topics which is everybody is very much interested in is this concept of fairness. So we'll definitely discuss that in detail, you know, after the takeaways. So, so it's Paul now. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I had on mute. Yeah, my thoughts have changed while other people talk, so I'm not really sure how relevant this is, but I'll say it anyway since I was on the list. The idea of omniscience, I'm countering the argument that that would be a state of boredom by saying instead, or maybe you've already said this, that it would be a state of insanity, because one would immediately start questioning their own omniscience. And also there's philosophical arguments that omniscience is possible, impossible, like in the philosophy of science, like the computer program that is supposed to predict everything, but it's wired to another computer that will do the opposite of everything it says. So it's essentially, the state of omniscience is a state of insanity, or the person constantly questioning their own omniscience. Just something along those lines I wanted your comment on.
So can you rephrase like a specific question out of it?
Do you think that if there was a way to see this thing called the Aleph, that the experience of all the possible potentials, one would immediately question which, for instance, the prediction of the future, which of the potentials will be actual? And then it is a never ending, no matter what you conjure up in a fantasy like this story, it's impossible to conjure up true omniscience. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that.
Okay.
Right. So with that, we're going to do the breakout rooms. John, do you want to specify the questions?
Yes. So we have three main questions. The first is two parts, and the second and third are just one question each. So the first question is, if you had the opportunity, would you look into the Aleph? Yes or no? And does your decision change if you, like Borges, begin to forget what you saw? So if you could like have this brief moment, like tonight or tomorrow, you know everything in the world, but then you start to forget everything eventually. Would you look into it? The second question is, do you believe that we need to be in a pursuit? Do you think the pursuit of something is a precursor to fulfillment? Do you think we have to be continually pursuing something to be satisfied and fulfilled in a creative, successful state? The third question is, would you personally lose motivation to experience new things if you never had any novel experiences? So if everything in your life you had to do over again, if you only had to relive your past, would life be interesting and motivating for you? In other words, if you had no new experiences from this day on, would you still be motivated to like go out and live in the world? So those are three questions. Would you look into the Aleph? Does it change if you could forget? Second, do you think we always have to be in pursuit of something to be fulfilled? And third, would you lose motivation with no new experiences? So with that said, Shrikant is going to automatically shuffle us into groups for anybody who's new here. And we're going to explain these questions for, I don't know how long, Shrikant, 20 minutes or something like that?
About 25 minutes. So we'll do 25 minutes and then come back. Also remember that all these 3 questions are on the meetup page. So if you want to refresh yourself, what the questions are, you can always do that. I'm opening the breakout rooms